Thank you, Ava. There's one thing Ava did not make reference to. As you know, it didn't cost you anything to get in here. However, it will cost a penny or two to get out. So, on behalf of the Fauquier Heritage and Preservation Foundation, I indeed express a hearty welcome to everyone. I had no idea that we would have this many people in here, but when I saw Edward Ashby come in, and I kind of figured Edward probably brought much of his family with him, I'm thinking, that's going to create a crowd in here in and of itself. Right, Edward? Right. But it's awfully good to have you folks here. Ava's indication that I'm connected at the hip with this part of the world is true. Lived here, went to school right up the street here, the old Marshall High School, and I know I have at least one other high school graduate. And I remember those days very vividly because we had a number of persons with whom we went to school who were Free Staters, admittedly so. But if you ever wanted to see a tremendous fight take place, those persons who would admit freely that they were Free Staters and the other people, oftentimes they would have a parting of the way. Now today, if you are a Free Stater, you wear a badge of honor up front. I am a Free Stater. And as a matter of fact, you even try to, if your home is not really in the area that is considered to be Free State, you gerrymandered some of the boundary lines so you can be included in that area as well. But it's certainly a pleasure for me to make this presentation. I'll try not to bore you to death with some of the information I have. This area that we call the Free State, that we call Fauquier County, that we call the Commonwealth of Virginia, started with a completely different set of folks. These individuals were people with names like Lord Thomas Fairfax and people like his mother, who also was in this area. They had accumulated over time about 5 million acres of land. Now, how did that all come about? England was going through some pretty stirring times at that time. If you were a supporter of the king, he would divvy up parcels of his land in the New World. And he did this. 5 million acres. Persons who, that would mean if you lived out on the Chesapeake Bay, you owned everything from the Potomac to the Rappahannock River. That was all yours. And that was the case of Thomas Lord Fairfax. And this is the good Lord right here. You may not be able to see his image much. He's wearing one of my old outfits. But anyhow, Thomas Lord Fairfax. And he was one of the first persons, he was a friend of the Crown because the individual who had been holding that crown had his head removed. So in the way of deciding that I want my friends to benefit from the properties that I have in the New World. And then after that, it becomes the part of our nation, a part of Fauquier County. It didn't become Fauquier County until 1759, and that's when the true value of the land called Fauquier went into play. I'm going to ask one of my colleagues, Laura, you ready? Laura is doing you have the first image up? I ask stupid questions because I don't dig AV. That's a picture of Charlie Ashby, and he is considered one of the kings of the Free State. He was the third and final king. And there were predecessors to him. There was a guy by the name of Timbre, who was a individual who declared himself to be the king of the Free State. And then immediately after him, there was Sandy Jeffries. Sandy Jeffries lived during the time of the American Civil War. As a matter of fact, the Civil War is what took Brother Jeffries away from here. He got into a fight with one of Mosby's rangers in his parlor of his house, and he was shot to death. And those kinds of things tended to happen. Next. That is Sir Francis Fauquier. Francis Fauquier, for whom this county is named, the name Fauquier probably sounds familiar to most of you, but to some of you it's still foreign. And the reason I say that is because when I was principal of a school, I would often get telephone calls and persons would say, "I hope I'm going to pronounce this name of your county correctly." And I can attest to the fact that some of the pronunciations that I received, some of them I had to clean up a little bit by the time that, but anyhow, the lieutenant governor of the colony of Virginia had no real persons who you would consider to be governors, because the governors were very wealthy men who oftentimes would stay back in England. They would send their lieutenant governors to Virginia, which they did with Francis Fauquier, and that name still may sound a little unusual to you, because Francis Fauquier was a Frenchman. He's actually a Huguenot. A Huguenot is a individual who practiced the faith of his fathers, but he was he was not a man of the holy cloth. So anyhow, Lieutenant Governor Francis Fauquier came to the New World as the governor. Okay? This man we do remember. And the man we remember, of course, is U.S. Supreme Court Chief Justice John Marshall. And if you drive about 3 miles west of here, you'll come by his home. And his home is a beautiful estate located on top of a hill. And he spent his boyhood here as well, not at the home, not at Oak Hill, but at another place called the Hollow. The Hollow is located about 2 miles from where he spent much of his time. But anyhow, the U.S. Chief Justice, and he would spend summers here as well. Okay? Now this is something that will entice more than one person in this room. The person standing there with the necktie is a guy by the name of Stanley Wolf. Stanley Wolf, if some of you remember who Stanley Wolf was, he was the sheriff in Fauquier County. And here he is standing arm in arm with a group of gentlemen who have just been asked to relinquish their medicinal spirits, might we say. So anyhow, this was back in the 1930s. And there were still stills in this area well beyond that. My father used to tell me when I would go walking through the woods with him, he would on a squirrel hunt, he would tell me, "Now, Bobby, you see that cabin up there in the woods that has the smoke coming out of the chimney? If you ever come here as a man, don't just tell them you're George's boy and you will be all right. But for God's sake, don't tell them you're somebody else." Because there were still moonshiners in this area, and I can attest to that fact. Okay? And this is the home of John Marshall. This is Oak Hill. That's where much of the boyhood of Marshall's family was spent there. Okay? And that's our house. That is the Old Stone Academy that now serves as our home base, one of our home bases. We now have two of them, and hopefully you will be available to visit us in each of those this afternoon sometime. Okay? By the way, if you have questions as we're going through this, don't hesitate to ask, okay? I taught school for 40 years, and I'm accustomed to that, believe me. This particular image is the Fry House. The Fry House no longer stands in Marshall. It's one of those houses that fell to the demolition corps when they came through. But this house had an interesting history to it, because if I were to point in that direction, which would be back towards Stevenson's Hill, this house played an integral part during the American Civil War, because John Mosby had men atop Stevenson's Hill who were lobbing shells toward the railway track, because the Union soldiers were putting the Union Railroad back together. One of the shells did not make it. It went into the upper side of the house, came through and into the floor of the kitchen. The lady who was living there, Mrs. Fry, promptly took her dish towel and picked the cannonball up and threw it out into the yard, causing the Yankee soldiers who were nearby to find as much and as quick cover as they possibly could. But as I've said, that old house no longer stands, and the unfortunate part is that it was destroyed about 3 years ago. So that's a recent demise. Okay? And this is another old house that no longer stands. If you visit the 7-Eleven, as I do with some degree of frequency, you're visiting the site of Squire Baker's house, and that was it. Squire Baker was a prominent individual here in town, particularly back prior to the American Civil War. Now, this gentleman, the jury is still out a little bit on this. This is, ever hear that poem, "That dirty little coward who killed Mr. Howard and laid poor Jesse in his grave"? Allegedly, that is Bob Ford, who is said to have assassinated Jesse James. His family lived here. They lived at Waveland. Now, as to whether Bob was a part and parcel of that, we are uncertain, but we are claiming him anyhow. Okay? And that's the Marshall Pharmacy. That's where we used to attend if we had medicinal problems or just wanted a nice counter beverage to drink of some sort. That was a place for particularly people like Duke Yao, who needed as much strength as he could get. Next. That's what the Southern Railway Depot looked like for many, many, many years. And the railroad initially came through this part of the world in 1852, and that was one of the stops. That is a period photograph that would take you back to the early 20s or so. But that old depot was there for a number of years as well, but has since gone by the side. Okay?
Where was that?
Right down in this direction. It's where the cinder block business is now on Main Street. As a matter of fact, right there on that. Yes, ma'am. Where was the pharmacy? Where the pharmacy still is. That grouping of buildings up there on Main Street and somebody help me with one of those names. The Red Truck. It's a part of the Red Truck Bakery, yeah. See, if you're asking for current information, as my wife would very quickly advise you, I still live in the 18th century, so don't ever be surprised. Yes?
As far as the railroad depot, was it demolished on purpose, or did it just go, what happened?
A little bit of both, because it was mostly destroyed by fire. And as a matter of fact, we have an image coming up here in a little bit. You will see one of the fires that took place down in that entire corner of town. But hopefully you'll see that in a moment. Okay? Now, this should be, it says Thomas OBannon. It should be William OBannon, but we'll make an error every now and then. This is the home place of Presley Neville OBannon. Anybody in here ever in the Marine Corps? Anybody? Oh, there we go. We've got a Marine back there. Thank you, General. I appreciate that. And he is a general, the guy. I just said that too. So, but anyhow, the Thomas OBannon House, as it's called here, it was the birthplace of Neville Presley OBannon. And OBannon was one of those heroes of the early Corps, about 1805, 1806 or so. The Barbary pirates were just bugging us to death over in North Africa. So what does President Jefferson do? He sends in the Marines and the Navy. And they quickly dispatched the pirates in that area. Is that pretty much stated, General?
That's it, sir.
There it is, yes. So anyhow, they were quickly dispatched. And even in today's Marine Corps, if you ever listen to the Marine hymn, you will hear from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. When they are singing that line in the Marine hymn, they are talking about the exploits of this young Marine who was born and raised here in Marshall. After his service to the Marine Corps, he then moved west to Kentucky, which was not unusual because a lot of persons moved west. The land was readily available out there, so it was not unusual to have people moving in that direction. But
that area, because they didn't have a sword, and Marine officers still carry that sword to this day.
That's right, yes. If you ever see a Marine and a Marine officer and look for his sword that he's wearing, that is a replica of the same sword that was banished in, back in that period of time. Next. This should be the Reynolds Store at the depot. It is now, this was destroyed by fire. There was a huge fire back in 1968, 61, somewhere in there, we'll see in a moment, that destroyed much of the buildings that were there on the railway, the rail track in Marshall. And that particular building is one of the buildings that bit the dust.
Bob, it was known as Johnny's Grocery then.
When it burned, yes, it was Johnny's Grocery. And the person who just put in that commercial ad was Maureen Lawrence, whose family owned Johnny's Grocery. If you apply for 10%, on that, you can get it, I'm sure. Okay. Now, you're talking about sophisticated things, and Marshall, of course, didn't move far from this level of sophistication as well. The fire department, back in the 40s, would suspend a railway tie between those two posts that you see there. And in the event of a fire, they didn't have a whistle, they didn't have an alarm of any other sort. They would have some able-bodied young men get out there and beat the bejeebus out of that tie, and that served as the unit of, that would bring all of the firemen from miles around. Okay? Now, that's the fire I was talking about. You're looking at Johnny's Grocery, you're looking down at that end of town. And of course, you see the Purina Chow building that is still there. But that's what happened to that end of town in 1961. Absolutely flattened. But that took the old railway depot and all of those types of things along with it. Okay? Now, this fellow has an interesting story that is attached to him. Henry Thomas Dixon. He lived in Dixon's Valley. Where else? How many of you know maybe where Dixon Valley is? Good, number of you do. Dixon Valley, if you go west of here, it's the area between here and Hume. But anyhow, the Dixon family owned multitude of acres out there. And Mr. Henry Thomas Dixon was what we might call today a true contrarian, because that was the year of the election in 1860. And at that time, elections were held, well, in this case, it was held up here at our home base across the street. And the vote was given by voice vote. No paper ballot, no anything of that sort. So Mr. Dixon, being a true contrarian, when his name was called out and he was asked, "For whom do you vote?" Mr. Dixon says, "I cast my vote for Abraham Lincoln." And you can imagine this quiet that descended, because he was the only vote cast for Abraham Lincoln in Fauquier County. And it was cast in our headquarters right across the street. Now you probably ask yourself, well, the Dixon family must have been true patriots and true men of our colors. No. Mr. Dixon was inclined to say, if his neighbor says, "That's blue," Mr. Dixon would be more inclined to say, "No, that's brown." And that's the way he got along with his neighbors, not well at all. Anyhow, after casting his vote, he then immediately boarded the train that was just east of where he was. And they didn't hear from him again until the war was at full throttle. And then after the war, he was still having difficulties with fellow human beings, and Mr. Dixon was shot to death in Alexandria, Virginia, by a guy by the name of Maddox. And the Maddox family, if you're familiar with those folks here in Marshall, that was a part and parcel of the same group. Now, this is the old Foley building. It still stands in Marshall, and it was used for a number of purposes. Now, this is Duke Yao in his first car. And he's riding with Jerry Carter up front, so that might look, for some of you, the names that I'm throwing around don't mean anything, but to the people whose names I'm using, it means everything. So, and as I would say, I have the microphone. So anyhow, this was Marshall's first Lincoln, and this Lincoln came from the Marshall Ford business. The Marshall Ford business began in 1916, and it is the oldest surviving Ford dealership in the Commonwealth of Virginia. It's been here ever since 1916. But those are some Marshall lights testing out their brand new spanking Lincoln.
Are you going to talk about the transition between Salem and Marshall?
If I don't, just pull my chime. This is one of the merchants who's given credit for renaming the town. In 1881, there was a lot of confusion in the Commonwealth of Virginia because there were a lot of places of like names. And one was here in Salem, as this town was then. So the postal authorities said, you folks have got to do something about this name because you've got mail going north and south and it belongs to these people or it belongs to you. So anyhow, that's when they decided, let's change the name of Salem to something else. Well, the fellow who decided on the something else, the fellow that's given credit, is Mr. Klippstein. And he's the merchant for whom the town's name was changed. So Mr. Philip Klippstein receives credit for making that change.
So it wasn't something that was put to a vote? It just Mr.
Oh, there was a vote, yes. Oh, yeah. It wasn't as simplistic, but the vote was predicated upon the recommendation of Mr. Klippstein. Mr. Klippstein was a very, very highly honored businessman in Marshall. And I don't think too many people, and it made sense, well, Justice Marshall's home is just west of us. Why not give some recognition to the Chief Justice? And that's exactly what happened. Any other questions? Now, this individual is a gentleman who has a village named after him. This is Robert Ross, and he was a wheelwright, as it says, who had a business on the other side of the tracks. And Mr. Ross gave the name to Rosstown. And not only was he an excellent wheelwright, but his wife, Helen, was said to make the best gingerbread and soup anywhere in town. So I guess that was her call to fame as well. But anyhow, Rosstown. How many of you, anybody know where Rosstown is? If you go east over the railroad tracks, as soon as you cross the railroad tracks going east, that little covey of buildings in there, and one of them is the Salem Baptist Church. The Salem Baptist Church is the only church in this area to maintain the old name of the old town itself. But it's an Afro-American community.
Was he a slave initially?
Yes, he was a slave who became a freeman, yes. Let's see, are we up to Moses yet? This is a couple of houses. This house no longer stands. This is pretty much up near where Holder Trumbo has his business in town at the present time. That has been leveled. Next. And this is given in commemoration to my good friend who we miss every day. He's been gone for 11 years, Mr. John Kenneth Gutt. This is where John was raised as a new baby, and he pontificated, began, I think, pontificating when he was first born. And if any of you knew John Gutt, he was a man who always had 1,000 different opinions. And if you don't believe me, go over to the Gutt Library. Much of the collection over there belonged to John Gutt. And take down some of the books that maybe John put in to our collection. Every now and then, you will find a book, and I won't use some of the language that is used, but if John disagreed with the author, you found out immediately, because John would let the reader beware as to what you would find after that.
Well, can you say where that house is? Can you tell everyone where that house is on Main Street?
Yeah, the house is up there on Main Street near the present post office, within a stone's throw of that. That is the former Old Marshall Methodist Church. And I guess that's why the Baptists feel so safe in this church. That particular church was burned down in 1898. So I don't know what that predicts or anything. But we have a picture of the original old church. Next. Now, this gentleman was a gentleman who had opinions, very strong opinions. He ran the barber shop here in town, Mr. Pine. And you were safe to go in there. He would give real good haircuts, no problem, as long as you belonged to one political persuasion. If you went into that shop, he would probably ask you sometime during your service, how do you stand on voting? And if you said, well, I vote with the Southern Baptist and that sort of thing, I'm fully in favor of that. If you said that was your faith, that you would put faith in, and that was your religious belief, and that was your spiritual belief, you were in good shape. But if you weren't, if you said you were a Republican, for example, the door would be held open for you, and you would be shown how it enters and exits. And that was Mr. Pine. And I came close to knowing him. I missed him by a few years. Okay, dear. One of the first councilmen in this area was a guy by the name of Julius Nachman. And Mr. Nachman was a very prominent citizen in this area as well. Marshall was a town, an official town for about 3 years. It was, up until that time, it was a wide spot in the road, which it is now. Because when it was incorporated, it had a mayor and a board and that sort of thing. But the town of Marshall decided after some political shenanigans that we don't want to be incorporated anymore. That meant Mr. Nachman was now out of a job. If you ever followed along with what happened in those political years, Marshall wanted to be incorporated because they knew the advantages of incorporation. There was a body of folks who didn't want it. Well, the folks who didn't want it eventually won the cause. And that's how the first dial telephone came into existence in 1944. And you would have to go through the services of Miss Daisy Harrell if you were inclined to wish to have a telephone call moved on. Okay? And you know, of course, that Mosby's last review was here on April 1865. And it's at this point, if you go up to the, what's the name of the restaurant up there on the corner, folks? Somebody help me out. Gentle Harvest. There is an obelisk there next to the Gentle Harvest that indicates that on or near that site is where John Mosby and his troop of partisans were disbanded. And Mosby, he didn't take a hike along with his men. He went on to fight for what he thought would be another day. And Mr. Mosby, of course, was certainly an individual of his own making, believe me. As a matter of fact, Mosby went on to become he was in the Grant administration, and surprising everybody because I'll give you a grandma's story. My grandmother, when I would go home every day, Grandma would ask me, Bobby, what did you learn in school today? I always would make sure that that answer was going to be history because I knew that's where she was directing toward. So on one occasion, I said, I was probably in the first or second grade, well, Grandma, today I learned about the gray ghost, John Mosby. Well, I knew there was something wrong because her countenance just dropped when I said that. I said, Grandma, did I make a mistake? No, not a major mistake. Well, what did I must have said something. She said, Bobby, we don't talk about him in this house. And I had been taught all along that if it was someone who was affiliated with the rebel cause, that was the way to go. But Grandma immediately let me know that Mosby was nothing but an old turncoat. Mosby had joined the Republican Party. Mosby had become many things, all of which my grandmother didn't care for. This was a solid South, and it was to remain so in her mind for at least those remaining years that she had. And this is beautiful downtown Marshall as it was in 1902, 1916. We have a ton of these images that are over there. If you would ever like to look at more or whatever the case might be, if you would like to review more, we've only shared with you maybe just a brief sample today. But if you would like to come over to the library at some point in time, we would be more than happy to help you out. That's pretty much the presentation that I had put together. Are there questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah, how did Free State name come about and come into being?
The
Geographic sort of demarcation.
Here is the, I've got a bad leg, so it's going to take a minute. I don't know if you can see the green outline on this map up here. That represents more or less, that green configuration represents the rough configuration of where the Free State is said to be. It's not any true place on a map. It's wherever you might wish for it to be. Because how it got its name, because the free spirits that lived there didn't believe in taxes, didn't believe in taxing any of those types of things. And this all came about because Chief Justice John Marshall and his brother had assumed some of the land that belonged to Lord Fairfax. And of course, when the people were there under the tutelage of Lord Fairfax, they were unaccustomed to paying taxes because they never saw a tax collector. When John Marshall and his brother gained ownership, that's when they said, we need to collect taxes from these people. Well, you're talking about an uproar. So that's pretty much the rationale behind the Free State. It's not a legal entity. It's not a boundary of any kind. It exists between your left and your right ear more than anything else. Yes, sir.
Dave shared an article today with me from the New York Times in 1911.
No.
And it said that the Hessians, soldiers, no, that settled the Free State.
No, no. And some of you may have read that as well, that the only Hessians that I'm familiar with that ever came to this, there was one Hessian, and his name was Klippstein. that is the only man of the Hessian background. It makes a nice story, but there is no truth nor evidence to prove that a troop of Hessian soldiers settled and began going to war against the local authorities. No. Yes, sir.
When did Salem actually become Marshall?
81. That's 1881. My wife always tells me to clarify those because she says I live in the 19th century, so I tend to assume that everyone else does. Yes, ma'am.
When the Marshals were collecting taxes, for whom were they collecting the taxes? For themselves?
Themselves.
And what would happen if you didn't pay your taxes?
Well, they would probably take you to court, and that's what they did. They took a number of the people to court, and of course that gave them time to, these folks, to seek other lands, perhaps to the west. Yeah. The Marshals took a number, as I've said, Marshals took a number of people to court for non-payment, back taxes, whatever the case might be. Yes, ma'am.
Is there a record of that, those court cases, or the people that were sort of challenging that?
I can only assume there probably was.
Yes, Bob, it's a good record. Fauquier County, what's all this?
And that's Tom Thorpe who's making that statement. Tom is somebody that the Marshals still owe tax money to. So it's with some degree of authority he says that. Yes, ma'am.
To be a free state, or was the only basic principle that you didn't like to pay taxes, or were there other things around that?
Oh, it was a free way of living. You didn't owe homage to any man or anything else. And I was telling someone earlier, if you were a outliner coming in this direction and you said, how do I get to the Free State? You would be advised by a Free Stater, oh, just go down the road another mile or two and you're there. Well, you would go down the road another mile or two and you would ask the next person, and they'd give you the same answer. Well, just go on down the road another mile or two. It has something to do with not wanting to be found. There's something to be said for that. I see a hand with a black sleeve.
How were property lines drawn?
How were
Free State, how did you know if the edge of your property is your neighbor's property?
That's a good question. I haven't the vaguest idea. And I don't know that they had the vaguest idea. Yes, ma'am.
Why would Justice Marshall, why would they feel they had the right to tax people? I mean, what gave them the right? I mean, Fairfax, that was part of England. I mean, when they...
Oh, no. The Marshals took over this. It had been owned by the Fairfax family, in effect. And the Marshals took that over because this was after the American Revolution. And of course, these Fairfax families were looking for other sources of income by that particular point in time. So that it just made sense. Tom?
It was 1806. They bought 160,000 acres, three of them. Marshall's brother and brother. And that's when they started taxing the large landowners first, and the small ones, which are our ancestors, later on. And they didn't want to pay taxes.
And when Tom says his ancestors, I get a chuckle because I can recall that Brother Edward Ashby and I used to have, in a kidding way, long extended conversations about taxation and whether the Ashbys paid or do they still owe. I think you still owe, don't you, Edward? Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
It almost sounds more like it might be considered rent if they consider themselves to own the property rather than first state taxation. At least that's what it sounds like.
Because the settlement on many of these claims didn't finish in the court system until after the Chief Justice was deceased. I mean, it went on and on and on forever because there was such uncertainty as to who owned the land and who didn't. Yes, sir.
Talk about the three kings of Free State, one of them was Charlie Ashby.
Mm-hmm.
What were they kings of?
I was going to bring that up to date and use modern terminology about people who consider themselves to be kings, but they're not. Well, anyhow, they were not kings in effect of anything. Mr. Ashby, though, he would assert himself, and he would go to Richmond every year. He didn't have the authority to do anything, but he would go into Richmond to represent the people of the Free State, and he would hold their feet to the fire. Now, what was he demanding? Did he have a right to demand that? The Free State, the kings of the Free State, well, one of the kings was simply a man of huge, that's Timbre. He was a huge, massive individual. And if he said he was the king of anything, you would say, yes, sir, I understand, sir. But there was no line of title or anything of that sort. Yes, sir.
When did the Free State come into existence, and when was the earliest mention of something called the Free State? About the 1700s, 1800s?
I would say probably the late 1700s or so, yeah. Yeah. But it's become, over the time, it has become a way of life. Because if you asked someone if they are a Free Stater, and they said yes, well, what does that mean? They would not be able to define any tax relief that gives them, or any power or prestige that gives them. They're just the king of something. So I don't know if there's any honorary information that comes with that. Yes, sir.
When I was in high school,
I've got to sit down.
there was a stigma that came from the Free State. One of my parents told me, you live so far in the sticks, they gotta take it in the sunshine.
You heard that one too, huh?
And now it's completely different.
Today, it's a distinct honor to be located anywhere in the Free State. As I said earlier, when I was going to high school up here, if you called someone a Free Stater, you had best be prepared to fling your gauntlets somewhere, because there was going to be, I'm not going to use the word, I'm in a church, but there was going to be one heck of a fight that was going to occur. And I've seen many of them. And there are probably some of you in here who participated in some of those. I see a number of Ashbys. I see one smiling at me through his mustache back there. That right, Skip? And I've never seen an Ashby who can't play music. They're born, when they get that first little pop on their behind, I guarantee you that that's going to be done with a bowstring. It has to be, Anybody else? Yes, sir. I see your hand. Oh, ma'am, I'm sorry.
Did Free State families, did they interact with other people in Fauquier County, our neighborhood? Did they just stay there together?
They were pretty much together people. Now, I'm sure they would interact with others if they were pressed into having to do so. But they were people unto themselves. They created their own rules and that sort of thing. And they are a very distinct breed of individual, believe me. Anyone else? If there are not any other questions, what I would invite you folks, yes?
I was curious about the old schoolhouse.
About what?
The old schoolhouse 18 over by the mill.
That's not in the Free State.
Oh,
Was it ever? No, no. It was not in the Free State, but it's a fantastic place to visit if you've not visited there.
How many people in this room would you consider that they think they're in the Free State, that they actually still live in the Free State?
Ben's asking the question up here. How many of you folks think today, after the discussion that you've had, that you live in the Free State? Here's what I would encourage you to do. On your next county income tax form, simply put on there, I'm not going to pay you another blank, blank, blank money. And let me know how that goes for you. I would be keenly interested, because there are some of us who don't live in the Free State, and I'd like to give that a try. Believe me. Yes, ma'am.
I think I may be terribly confused historically, or maybe hysterically, but at one point I thought Free State meant that these people did not, that they, in the South, they did not become a part of the Confederacy. So is that ever used in that way?
Well, Free State has been applied to many jurisdictions all over the country. Maryland, for example, is called the Free State of Maryland. There are other jurisdictions throughout the United States that are called the Free State of. So having the name simply Free State doesn't, it's worth pretty much the paper that it's printed on. But for those people who can make that an issue, right, go back to the taxation thing. I would stand well behind you if you were inclined to do that on your next tax thing. But the idea of being a free stater is pretty much in the mind of the beholder, really. I would like to invite everyone, please, to go next door. There's a building over there. It's named for someone who we couldn't find anybody else to name it for, so it's across the way. But also the Gutt Library. The Gutt Library contains about almost 7,000 books on various subjects, most of which are dealing with Fauquier County. Yes, ma'am.
So are any of John Marshall's descendants in the area, and whatever happened with Oak Hill?
Oak Hill, I'm not familiar with where it is today. But the first question, are there any John Marshall descendants? Those of you who claim descendants from John Marshall, would you please stand? I'm surprised that there are not 15 people standing up, because the descendants of the Marshall family are all over the place. I've often thought about casting a rock out of the building over there, and I would watch either a descendant of a Marshall or a descendant be hit with that stone. So Marshalls are very, very thick and many at this point in time. There was a second part to your question, though, wasn't there?
Oak Hill.
Oak Hill. Oak Hill, I know, isn't it owned by that winery out there? I don't know. I don't know. I know that they were trying to get a squatter's claim on that old mill out there. And by the way, that is for sale. So if any of you would like to go home and count your pennies tonight, that you'd be doing Fauquier County a real service by, getting that involved. Yes, ma'am.
It seems like the name Ashby is synonymous with the Free State.
Yes, ma'am.
So are there descendants of Charlie Ashby here today?
I met at least one. And Maureen is. Is there any Ashby in here who is not descended from Charlie Ashby? Folks, I thank you so much for coming by this afternoon. if you would please visit us at the building immediately across the way or at the Gutt Library. We'd love to have you there, and we'd love to see you. And because that was said, and don't forget this when you're leaving today. Take care.